So, hello everybody, and welcome to tonight's session on returning to competition, track edition. Really excited to host this because track is one of the first things that's getting kicked off into proper competition very, very soon. So for those who don't know me, my name is Ashley Ryan. I'm the Event Workforce Officer, and tonight I'm supported by Jill and Maddie, who are some of the CDCs. They are from Clubland, so they support our club development team. So they don't have that expert knowledge, but they'll try their best to answer your questions. If not, they'll be fielded to the end for me or to help out with at the end. Tonight is being recorded, as all our sessions are, and that's so that those of people that couldn't make it tonight, they can catch up on YouTube afterwards and be able to watch back and then send in their questions if they have any too, so everybody can get the most out of it. I'm also going to be putting a little evaluation form in the chat as well, so that I can get some instant feedback from you. Hopefully it only takes about a minute to complete, and that's so that I can make sure these sessions are what the groups need, because I've got a few more coming up for different disciplines too. So without further ado, we'll just get started. So a similar format to the time trial one, those of you that were there, will quickly talk about guidance, then a bit about training. Then our special guests from Newcastle, Alex and Norman, are going to share their experience putting on events with restrictions down there. Then we're going to have a little bit of time in breakout rooms with some discussion points, and just ending with some general questions. So we've got an hour scheduled tonight, and we'll just see how it goes with the discussion. It might take an hour, might take a little bit more, a little bit less, but I'm happy to talk to you, not all night, but I will talk to you if you have relevant questions. So guidance, we should all know this now up here. So exciting that last week we could finally get activity back on. So many club compliant time trials starting back up, and gradually more events coming back on the system, including some track events. So the biggest changes were that we can now move all around Scotland. We can have cycling competitions again, and the one I always find most interesting is the last point there, that we have a limit of 200 people currently that are allowed to be at events. So that is everybody, the riders, officials, volunteers, and any helpers and entourage that need to come as well. This hopefully is familiar. It's found on the main page of the Scottish Cycling website, and we also send updates directly through our events team newsletter. So if you don't get that and you'd like it, please email me afterwards and I'll get you subscribed up to that. So a little bit about training. There is quite a lot going on at the moment, which is really great for all our officials and volunteers. Specifically for officials, the UCI and British Cycling are putting on regular webinars. British Cycling's next one is in June, and the topic for that is wellbeing and safeguarding. So that one should be very interesting. British Cycling are also soon going to be launching some online modules that we'll be able to use as refreshers and also kind of test for them. So that's very exciting, and that news should be coming out this week or next week for you to be able to access it. We've also obviously got our webinars. We've got more, aside from these return to competition ones, we do have other ones in the works, which I'm hoping to publish in this month's newsletter. Organisers, the webinars, some of them are also specifically aimed at you guys, but we've also got new organiser training coming up for people looking to put on events next year, and also a troubleshooting session for the events management system. That one's open to everybody. So anybody that just wants to learn those quirks in the system when you're putting on your event, you are more than welcome. It's probably going to be a sort of drop-in session with specific topics throughout that night. And lastly, if you're a volunteer, if you've got a very specific role or work generally, there is going to be some discipline-specific training. So again, that will come out in newsletter, just keep your eye out. Or if you think that there is something that's needed that's been missed off, please do get in touch and tell us, because we will help to try and facilitate that where we can. So enough from me. Let's get on to the track stuff, why we're here tonight. So as I say, we're very lucky to have Alex and Norman here tonight to share their experience. So Alex, he organises the Newcastle Track League, and he started helping out back in the early 2010s. And he's been doing that he's been organising since 2019. And following up from Alex, Norman's going to talk to us a little bit as well about organising youth omniums. And he also wears several different hats, as many of us do. So yes, take it away, Alex.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm the track league organizer for Newcastle Track. It was a relatively sort of weird sort of process to bring the track league back online when we were sort of in the middle of the pandemic. I think the biggest issue that we had when we were sort of starting the process was, will we actually have any volunteers to help us to do any of this? And I think that was the main sort of thing that we needed to start with, is do we have enough people to run the event? So before we started going down all the COVID routes and what procedures do we need to put in place, have we actually got enough people in the first place to run the event safely? You know, at that point, we didn't have a vaccine, we didn't have any of the stuff we do have now, which I think we're in a much better place. So volunteers are more willing to come down and help us. So I think at that point it was a bit of a what do we have on offer for us? So nowadays it's a little bit easier. Once we knew that we had volunteers, because obviously, you know, at that point events were quite restricted in terms of the number of them. Volunteers were coming out the woodwork, and we actually had to turn volunteers away. So we had to sort of be a bit sort of careful of how many volunteers we actually took on board. But in terms of the sort of COVID side of things, the main thing that we had to do was try and sort of figure out how to use the venue in the best way. So we've got a main entrance and exit gate. So how do we get people from there into the track safely, into a bubble, and then from those bubbles onto the track and off the track again? And all the time thinking of actually, how do we reduce the contact? How do we reduce those sort of crossing points as much as possible? And I think from my sort of perspective, it was a case of, is there any one ways? Is there any routes that we can put them down? It was quite a challenge as such, to sort of figure out how to get 100 and something odd people into this venue safely. So we sort of devised this process where we split the track up into 5 different zones. So thankfully we can use the top of the track and top of the bankings. So we basically just said, you know, look, you know, that's your zone, spread yourselves out, use as much space as you can, and really sort of, you know, social distance between yourselves. So when you're not racing, you're off, you are socially distanced away from each other. And then obviously once you're racing, you know, go for it and just be careful. Yeah, it's quite an interesting sort of tactic, and I think the zones helped us to keep everybody safe.
Were people quite good at policing themselves,
yeah,
their space and their zones?
Yeah, so because we sort of said, you know, that's your zone, you look after it, you know, and we're willing to, so from a commissaire's point of view, so I talked to my commissaires, and because I have 2 commissaires that come down on regularly that help me. So I was talking to them about how will we actually enforce the COVID rules that we're putting in place. And it was a case of, when we were sort of going through those discussions, we were looking at it as an extension of the technical regs. So when we were sort of going through the sort of regulations of how to actually put them into place, we were going, well, actually, as an event organizer, as a commissaire, let's use our power as those to actually enforce those COVID rules as well. So they did know that, you know, we are prepared to remove people from the venue, remove them from the event if they were breaking those. So yeah, they sort of knew that, and I think most of them, though, to be fair, were just happy to be racing, and they did whatever we told them to do just to get a number on the back and get going again. So
yeah, that's exciting. Yeah, I imagine people were dying to get back involved.
Yeah. I think a lot of them were nervous to start off with because they were a bit anxious with all the sort of COVID stuff out there, and for most of them it was the first event they ever gone back to. So having that clear communication, because we put out a video, safety induction video, and something like a 22-page document plan which said all the different procedures that we had. So when we have a rain situation and we cancel the play, you know, what's the process for getting everybody back out, what's the process for getting them in, what's the warm-up procedures. So literally went through everything from start to finish, so everyone was aware of what they had to do. And I think because of all that, it sort of helped settle the nerves a little bit, because they all knew what was there, and if anybody was doing something wrong, somebody could say, okay, well, actually, no, you need to do this instead.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Norman.
Well, I was fortunate or unfortunate. I ran a few sportifs at the end of last year. And one thing I did notice is if you tell people to do something, you have to, you have to keep reminding what they should be doing, which isn't easy. And also make sure that you have got, if you say there is toilets, make sure there is hand sanitizer and toilet paper, and you can clean and wash your hands. Because what happens otherwise is they get irritated, because people have had a year of stuff at the moment, and it becomes very difficult because they go to work and they're told what to do, and so they expect stuff to be ready. Alex work for the track league, and BC in England have used a lot of it as well to get their most stuff working, and I've taken Alex's to use for a one-off event, which is the Youth Omnium, which we have this weekend. One problem that's shown up with the Youth Omniums that have taken place is, of course, that there is technically no spectators. If you take, I don't know about Scotland, how and when that finishes, but if you take that to the nth degree, and then you take from young riders their helpers that are normally there when they race, it does leave an issue, not just on the safeguarding, but also you're leaving people in a vulnerable position. So I've taken the approach that every youth rider is allowed, if their parents want, one helper who's there for not as a spectator. That is important to emphasize, but for vulnerable adult or vulnerable child purposes, and that is it. And we've also going to allow one club coach in from a club who's got more than one rider in the event, because that seems to be a bit of a problem, that you occasionally get that parent, maybe a mother, who doesn't know much about it, and if there's a club coach there. But taking Alex's so I have 4 age groups, boys and girls, 2 boys age groups and 2 girls, which are separated into 4 zones. And then we have another zone which will be used for the club coaches. So if anybody wants to talk to a club coach, they have to come out of their zone and socially distance to talk to that coach. And the people that are there for with their child, the only reason they can leave that area is if to go to the toilet. They can't then go and walk round, and they have to understand they can't go and be sociable like they normally do, really, which is sometimes hard to enforce when they're missing the same people their kids have raced with for a year now. So that's important. And obviously, along with the normal thing as an organizer, make sure you've got enough toilet paper, and you have to make sure you've got the paper towels and the soap and everything that's there for them to use. Otherwise, you just end up with irritated parents. We know what they're like at times. So.
I don't know what you mean, Norman. It's actually quite good you brought up that fact about where people are going to be, because I think one of the issues down south at a particular race was they had the parents there, and obviously they need somewhere to go. And I think at one of the races they started congregating at a similar point, and it just naturally they weren't socially distancing. So that's something for organisers and officials to be considering when working together is having that place where they can go, as you've spoken about with your zone. So that's very, very useful.
Yeah, because then they become spectators.
Yeah.
And you're not allowed spectators at the moment.
So there's a few questions coming through in the chat, so I'll just read them out, and whoever would like to answer, Norman or Alex. Jan was asking, how do you enforce the zones? Do you have wristbands? Lanyards.
Lanyards. So I've made lanyards for the volunteers. It's probably, is it backwards at your end? I can never work it out. Yeah. So there's lanyards for the officials, which are one colour, so they are the people in the track centre. Then each club coaches have got one, and then each parent or guardian has got another colour, which that goes with their age group. So if you see them walking around, then you have to say, sorry, you shouldn't be here, you should be somewhere else. Because on a one-day event, you don't know these people. And that's the other thing. You don't know which child they are with or whatever. Whereas if you're on like adult on the track, like Alex is doing on the track league, most of the people you do know, and most of those are adults, and they're over 18, so they don't need a parent to come with them as yet anyway.
What's happening to your lanyards afterwards? Somebody's asking, are you collecting them in, or are they taking them home to reduce?
Bucket.
Buckets. Okay.
Bucket. Yeah. Just one thing. Alex mentioned the volunteers. So I've been speaking to my volunteers for the last 2 weeks. And a couple of things have cropped up is the confidence of those volunteers to carry out their task and how are they going to do it. Now, I was quite surprised with one, which was when we do the time trials, you need a holder. So obviously, when I've used parents as holders in the past, it's always ended up a bit of a disaster. So the idea was to designate one person who's got hand sanitizer and wearing a mask to go to the back. Now, this volunteer who's well known wasn't happy to do that. So what I've actually done is we're going to give every rider a face mask with their when they pick their numbers up, which they pick up in a bag with the pins and everything that they need, including the chip. And they have to turn up at the time trial wearing that mask, which then will be thrown in a bucket or receptacle once they've set themselves in the holders at the back of the bike. And that gave that person confidence that they'd be happy to do that job. So you have to talk to your volunteers and instill confidence in those. Sorry, that's a bit different, but
no, it's very useful, quite appropriate, because Kevin was asking about some of the practicalities around the actual racing and what things were different from normal. One of the points was the holders, but also things like gear checks. So some of those things are actually going on and racing's happening.
For gear checks, we basically said that the riders have to do the rollout themselves, but it will obviously be observed by the official. So whether that's a commissaire or whoever needs to observe that particular rollout. Obviously the rider will do the rollout, so they're handling their own bike. There's no cross-contamination between the two. So from the rider to the official. And then obviously if we do need that commissaire to roll it out, so if it's like, we're talking millimeters over or something like that, we can then use the hand sanitizer before we touch the bike, go over, roll it out, hand sanitize again. So we're always just constantly doing that sort of double check and reinforcing the hand sanitizer, getting it sort of protected. In terms of the racing side, the formats had to change a bit. I was actually talking to one of my volunteers today about how we're running it, because we had an issue where we've got 7 sprinters and we're trying to run team sprints, and obviously 7 doesn't go into teams. So we're a bit like, okay, well, how can we do it? Because we can't take a rider from our normal process without COVID would be to take another rider from another group and sort of jump them in onto another team. Obviously we couldn't do that this year because of crossing the bubbles. So we've had to sort of change the formats around and make it work for that particular event. So we've had to sort of go, okay, well, for that week, we'll take that event out and actually put another duplicate event in. So instead of running one keyring, we'll actually run 2 keyrings and have them as 2 separate events. So just working with what numbers you got and be prepared to change it last minute.
No, that's useful. Later on when we're going into our breakout rooms, one of the things that the groups are going to go away and discuss is potentially formats and how things might have to change to accommodate this reduced numbers and bubbles and things. So that's very helpful. Steve has asked, he has COVID marshals at his workplace to keep the trips socially separated, and that means that they've needed more supervision, and he presumes that organisers will need more volunteers to fulfil this role. How do you corral people, basically?
Well, I mean, on spot, you have to be, well, just mention, should you be here? I think you have to be abrupt to people. I think it's that easy at the moment. It's different in a, it's the same in a workplace. You can't just start shouting at people. I think you have to use your lack of personality, in my case, or your own personality, to suggest people go back to where they should be. You know, you either do that, in my case, probably sarcasm, and other people will be questioning them in a different way.
Right. Steve, is your hand up, or is it just kind of waving?
Yeah, I understand what Norman's saying, but it's you'll need more people to actually do that.
Well, you will do, but I think if you, as Alec's work has been fantastic and told people what they need to be doing, and as Alex said in the track league, a lot of people, they are glad to be there, and the emails I'm getting are generally from people who are glad there's something on. So obviously boredom will set in at times, and then you'll have to have a chat with them. As in more people, it's an omnium. Once you've got the time trial out of the way, there's always people around to do that. But I can see my job as an organizer is to leave myself free to make sure that people are complying with what is happening. And I know that's what Alex would spend a lot of his time doing at Newcastle, to make sure people are complying with it.
So one of the things that British Cycling have asked us to do is to sort of nominate a COVID officer, a COVID marshal sort of thing. So one of the things that I did was I said, well, because I'm the event organizer and I've delegated most of the roles out to everybody else, I'll take that COVID role up so that I know then from my own point of view what should be going on. And I can sort of go out and say, right, okay, well, you know, look, I've organized this event and I know that you shouldn't be doing this. Therefore, can you do this instead, please? So having that sort of reinforcement there, just you should have somebody that is solely really responsible for just looking at it, but it can only be one person. Most people, you know, are following the rules. It's just the odd one or two here and there where you need to sort of just gently nudge them to remind them.
Do we have any more questions from the floor? Norman and Alex are going to stay around for the breakout rooms, so we'll be able to get in a bit more in depth, and you know, more in depth about things like during racing and things that we need to consider. Because I appreciate there's a lot of commissaires in the room as well that might have specific questions that they want to discuss with their colleagues. But are there any questions right now? If not, I will share my screen again. Seamlessly this time round, I hope. There we go. So we're going to go into breakout rooms, and there should be about 4 rooms. So I'd like everybody to have a chat about things during competition. And some ideas about what that might include is, how are you managing equipment, rider flows? How do you communicate with various groups? So that might be your volunteers, it might be fellow officials, it might be a rider that you want to disqualify. How are we going to go about that with these restrictions? And another key group is the first aid. Like I think it was Alex saying earlier, and Norman was reiterating, everybody's excited to be back. Everybody's really thankful to be back, but everybody's going to be naturally a bit rusty at going back to the track. So there might be some little jitters. So first aid might be needed. So something to consider is, how is that going to work as part of your team? And if you get through that, if the first two groups could have a wee chat about some of the pre-competition stuff. How are you going to communicate with your officials and volunteers before the day? Is there anything different about that you're going to be doing? Talk a bit about rider entry. How are you going to recommend doing that? Is it all going to be online, or are you going to have some rock up on the day that you're going to have to sign up? Is that possible? And then talking about the support events and formats as well, something to consider. And the second two groups, we're more looking at post-competition and results. Because I appreciate that in track, sometimes it's not waiting to the end of the day to see what the result is, and that's ever changing throughout the competition. So how are we going to handle results, sharing results with the relevant groups in a COVID safe way? Because we obviously don't want one board with all the results up that everybody has to rock up and view, because they're not going to be socially distanced at that point. So how are we going to do that, and how are we going to facilitate that? And so distributing the events, and if you have to review things as a team, if somebody questions a result or a decision, how are you going to safely process that and facilitate that? So without further ado, we are going to go into those groups, and I would really appreciate it if one person from each group would volunteer to feed back to us all when we come back. We're going to have 10 minutes. Yeah, I can see Norman doing it already. It's really helpful to take a wee picture to give yourself a reminder of what areas we're talking about, or a screenshot. So hopefully you have all nominated somebody to feed back to us. So group number one, who's volunteering to tell us what you were chatting about?
I'm doing that one, Ashley.
Oh, great. Thank you, Ian.
So other than Paul revealing his new, or not revealing, but telling us about his new look, but keeping us on tenterhooks as to actually what he actually looks like.
Oh.
I'll leave that one hanging there. We had Sean in our group, who, as part of the Track League Committee, has been in discussions with Glasgow Life. So we spent a lot of the time Sean just giving us a bit of a view on what they're saying about things. And as far as Glasgow is concerned, and returning into the velodrome there, a lot of that is dictated by what Glasgow Life will or will not permit at the moment. So some of the headlines from that is a one-way system planned for around the whole track, both inside and outside. Would look at doing online entry only, ticking people off as they come in for going down into the track. Very limited numbers allowed, 30 people inside the track, including officials and including first aid. So they've been working on a plan for Track League could operate with 5 officials, 2 first aiders. That only leaves 23 riders, or space for 23 riders. Potential for youth riders going first, clearly, because there's less restrictions around them. But at the moment, Glasgow Life are looking at a maximum field size of 15 for them as well. I'm not quite sure how that would work. And if there were to be different groups riding on the same night or the same day, a 30-minute break in between groups to allow just for sanitation and cleaning. Glasgow Life also looking for recertification of any riders that are going to ride on track because of this rustiness issue, unless other than those that are in the elite squad. So anybody else would have to do some form of recertification beforehand before being on the track. And that was about it. Sean, is there anything I've missed you want to add in?
Sorry, I've just muted. Yeah, the only thing is that these discussions predate the latest round of lifting, and we'll have to have more detailed discussions again with Glasgow Life, which is something that we are planning to do before the end of this month. Paul has also pointed out to me that while we have occasionally been updating riders on what's going on, we haven't actually told the officials. So we need to look at better comms with our own volunteers. And I'll certainly take that to the next committee meeting, and we'll make sure that you get circulars as well.
Well, thank you, Group 1. Sounds like a really interesting chat. You know, even the little minute details like 13 minutes to sanitize an area is just so important. Every minute counts, and every person really does count.
Actually, it's 30 minutes. They're talking about half an hour.
I was going to say 13, Stack. 30.
Apologies, Ashley.
That soon eats up the day, though, doesn't it? You've got your limited people, and then you've got 30 minutes to consider to do a good job of sanitizing. Yeah.
Well, the problem you're going to have there is if you've got a schedule running and you've got 3 groups and you're rotating between the groups for each race, there's an hour and a half out your schedule for cleaning.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the start back is going to look more like Super Saturday than Track League.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, on that note, is it going to be Glasgow Life that's going to be doing the sanitisation?
That's a good question, Steve.
Because a lot of the questions we were having, we hear that the practice is the organizer will need to provide this, that, and the other, and it's you're going to be buying a lot of sanitizer, but it's going to require a lot more constant attendance and input from Glasgow Life. And I don't want to sound political, even with a small p, but that might take some prodding, if that's the right way of doing it. If they are going to be doing the sanitization, if they are going to need to be paying more attention to toilet rolls and hand sanitizer and stuff, and there's a lot of, I think there's maybe quite a lot of detail to be thrashed out there between whoever is sorting out Track League, and forgive me if I'm telling you stuff you already know, and Glasgow Life, because they have perhaps been, their hands may have been tied slightly in the past.
Yep.
That's definitely an interesting point to consider, Steve. Group 2, would you like somebody to share your highlights, please?
I'll continue on that vein. And we it was very good hearing the level of detail that the organisers have now got to go into. Things we were discussing, things like if there is a racing accident beforehand, instinctively if you were on that corner, you wouldn't think you would just, if there was a bike blocking the track, you just grab that bike and move it out the way. Now, technically, you've got unclean hands, so you've got to do something about that before you continue on your, even carrying out your duty. So theoretically, you're going to have to stop the race and go and sanitize your hands and come back if you're on that corner. Again, there's a lot of, I think there's an awful lot of detail to be worked through, is my feeling. I'm maybe more obsessed with the velodrome and the indoor side of things. Perhaps outdoors it's slightly easier in that regard. I don't know, but we certainly there's a lot of things that we could see as problematic, and I think Helen was pointing out, and I don't know how this ties in with what the official line is, that it could be quite a while before we get indoor sports back as we know them. Certainly in the Sir Chris Hoy Velodrome.
Yeah, the latest I heard today, not about racing, but they are hoping in the near future to get accreditation back up and running. Obviously with all their restrictions and things, but that's very specifically at Glasgow. Thank you, Group 2. I'm conscious of time. We've not got that much left. Group 3, who'd like to feedback?
Can't remember if it was Group 3 or Group 4, but got nominated anyway.
Go ahead, Martin.
So Carol was obviously representing the Glasgow track, myself the outdoor track in Dundee, and the main thing that was getting across was the importance of keeping the bubbles as clean as possible. so that your rider bubbles are kept separately from your officials are kept separately from timekeepers. So you're just trying to keep small working groups as much as possible throughout the meeting, where they can, for people to bring their own equipment. And if they are having to borrow equipment or use equipment, it's sanitized before being handed out and put somewhere in a sterile box at the end of the day, and then sanitized before it's cleared away. Glasgow, I think what had been alluded to there was the challenges of moving riders around, because Carol's organising the British Nationals later this year, and they're looking at using the holding areas out at the back for the different rider pens and just bringing them through as and when they have a race coming up, but keeping them completely separate from the track centre. Making sure if officials have got to move around, that they can do safely. Again, in Glasgow, where the judge arbiter might need to cross the track and walk across in front of spectators, if spectators are allowed, that there's enough allowance to keep a clear corridor for them to get through without being close to any of the spectators. We're talking about communications as well, and certainly for Dundee, we're looking at using Facebook. We've set up a Facebook group for the events for everybody who's interested, whether they're coming to the event or not, to see what's happening. We'll be using live timing and the MyLap system for publishing the results, so riders can actually see them, as well as copying them to the Facebook group as well. So if there's any queries, they can come back to us through the Facebook group. The commissaires will be using WhatsApp, so we can communicate with them. They can communicate with each other, and we'll send them the start sheets as and when they require them. But aiming to be paperless if we can.
That's great. Thank you very much, Martin. Very good point about things like the judge arbiter. If you've got your spectators, when I was in the room, you're talking about perhaps that whole area won't be able to have spectators depending on what the restrictions are at that point. So the final group, who is going to share from there?
Yeah, I'll say something. Martin's covered two of the points I was going to mention about WhatsApp and Facebook. Communicating to the riders, we've got a PA system. Also, we can have two-way radios for marshals and officials to also talk to each other, so we don't have to run around or get any help. One of the things that was particularly discussed was really the need to kind of map out where all these bubbles are, where these communities of riders are, or parents. I really like the lanyard system that was shown earlier, and basically identifying, how does it flow? If they want to get to the toilets, what's the most efficient and least crowded way for them to get somewhere? Having one-way systems and just trying to work out how people get around without clashing and congregating. Yeah, I think that's it really.
Yeah, it's a big jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
Big jigsaw puzzle. But if we put that thought in together now, on the day, it hopefully will be smooth. Because the feedback from organisers that have done things, and I'm sure Norman and Alex, well, I hope Norman and Alex will share this view, that when riders are coming, they're just so excited to be there. They're really listening and trying to do everything right so that the event goes ahead as safely as possible, because they don't want racing to stop once it's back now. They want it back on. So hopefully that means they'll follow these flows. They'll be listening as to where to find their results and things like that, rather than trying to approach people directly too much anyway. Now,
sorry, I was just going to say, it's about having confidence. So if you're planning an event, I think you just have to walk through. What would that group do? How can you lessen the crossover between that group and the group that's next to them? So I think if you just follow the flow of what that particular group would do, and once they're in there, then how do they get to the toilets? Which is the best flow way for them to get to the toilets? And I think if you break that down to, so you've got 5 different or 4 different events, and then make sure that, worry about that everybody has got the equipment, as in hand sanitizer, masks, and that sort of stuff, that they can carry out their job. So if someone does fall off the track, there is something for the person who's picking the bike up, which will happen, to clean their hands. and give them the confidence that they can pick that bike up, not think, well, what do we do if I pick this bike up? That if they pick that bike up, they can put that bike on the side and then they can clean their hands. And that's the thing, it's instilling confidence in people, and it can all happen and it can all flow. So it's just a matter of instilling the confidence that will be, you know, and it will be okay. It's that, you know, and people do listen, contrary, you know, you might have to tell them 200 times, but they will listen.
That's reassuring, Norman, thank you. So that kind of is the natural end to where I wanted to cover tonight in general. As I say, this is going to be recorded and shared afterwards. There'll be a follow-up email with the evaluation form and things like that. But it's not the end of the night quite yet if you don't want it to be. So if anybody has to leave, because it is, yeah, that's bang on 8:30 now. If anybody has to leave, please don't feel like obliged to stay, and have a good night, have a good evening. But if people want to stay and have a general chat about things, because we didn't get really in depth about some areas, but if people do want to talk about some particular things and answer some particular questions, I know that Martin asked earlier on some question about government guidance that I wanted to come back to at the end. But if you need to go, good night, have a good evening, and I hope this was helpful, and I'll send out that evaluation to everybody in the email. So thank you. I'll stop sharing. There we go. Hopefully we can all see our faces, and we can stop recording for tonight.